Hi there, this is Rajeswari Ramani for Asian Agribiz. GM crops have weathered many a controversy, but now the momentum for it is building in Asia. Leading the charge is China, a key player in the grain market. My colleague Zara Imtiaz talks to co-founder of Sitonia Consulting, based in China, about the challenges and future of GM grain policy in China. What happens in China will have important reverberations across the rest of the world.
Thank you, Darin, for joining us on our podcast today. So we're going to discuss the situation of GM crops in Asia. There's a lot of interest in GM in Southeast and South Asia as many countries look to move away from import dependency of the two major grains, corn and soybean. How do you see this playing out? Do you see the red tape on GM being removed?
Yeah, so I think that most countries in the region, including China, are obviously getting more concerned about food security, about being able to limit how much they import. So I think from a government perspective, there's a lot of reasons that these countries are trying to improve GM technology, approve the seeds being used. But at the same time, I think there's also still a lot of concern among the sort of general public who maybe don't have much experience or education with these crops. And because of that, I think there's a bit of hesitancy still in the region and in China about things like food safety and how these are, and basically how these are going to be incorporated into the food supply.
They're very headstrong about this, and this year they announced two standards, the safety certificate and a variety approval to clear the path to growing GM domestically. So how will this change the grain trade within and outside China?
Yeah, so I think it's going to first of all be a pretty long-term process. So because of the fact that this only happened, within the past year, China's relatively behind other countries when it comes to GM technology. They're definitely behind the US, they're behind Brazil, and there really hasn't been much work done in this area. At the same time, the government's putting a lot of resources into this. So for example, we've seen in the past 5 years or so that the Chinese government has tried to also increase its sort of own self-reliance on semiconductors and computer chips. So that's been a huge push by the government, pouring billions of subsidies into this. At the same time, when you hear them talk about GM seeds, a lot of times they'll refer to it almost like the chips of plants, basically making the comparison that much like China should be more self-reliant on computer chips and make its own within the country, they use that exact same language when talking about GM seeds. So there has been this really big push to develop these sort of seed research centers and to build up this technology domestically. But at the same time, they can't really do this overnight. I mean, you have decades of experience for companies in the US doing this. So China's relatively new to the game, and this isn't something that they can just do overnight. So it's going to be several years. So in the meantime, I think China's still going to need to import corn. It's obviously going to need to import plenty of soybeans as well. The long-term goal is obviously that the country can sort of reduce its dependence on imports, hopefully through the use of GM seeds. But I don't think that's going to be something that changes dramatically within the next 5 years.
But in the meantime, I think they've asked feed millers and producers to reduce the amount of soybean and even corn used in animal feed. How is this progressing? I mean, we've seen this continuously coming up in, I think, the last 2 years or so.
So there is an idea to reduce the amount of soybean meal, especially. But this is, it's not really going to solve any sort of big issue. So one of the things that is often talked about is using alternatives. So this might be things like rapeseed meal. This might be things like sunflower meal, and also things like peanut meal. I mean, it's sort of a wide range of different proteins. But we did some analysis on this last month, and basically those products in terms of domestic production, it's not going up either. So even if they reduce the amount of soybean meal usage, that usually just means importing an alternative. So it's still importing, but rather than importing soybeans from Brazil, they're importing sunflower meal from Ukraine, for example. So it doesn't really fix that problem. Some of the companies have also started using, amino acids, for example, to supplement the protein, but those amino acids still have to come from someplace. That usually comes from someplace within China, because usually that's coming from corn. So China has a big industrial corn processing sector. They make a lot of amino acids. But if these farms are switching from soybean meal to amino acids, that basically just then switches that part of the equation over to coming from corn. So then China needs to import more corn for the industrial processing sector. So in the long term, it doesn't really change the issue. I mean, the grain still needs to come from someplace, the protein still needs to come from someplace, and a lot of times that means imports. The other thing to keep in mind is that we might see some improvements simply because they're trying to be more scientific in how they do animal feed. So within China, corn is relatively expensive because of these trade policies and these quotas that limit imports. So a lot of times soybean meal is relatively cheaper compared to corn than it is in other parts of the world. And so farmers will feed more soybean meal because it's basically cheaper per calorie. But that's also not really an issue that's going to go away. We can sort of improve how the farmers do their nutrition and be more scientific about it. But in the long term, it's not really going to reduce China's dependence on imports too much. But I would say in the next few years, China's still going to be pretty dependent on soybeans. Soybeans coming from basically the US, Argentina, and Brazil.
You don't see novel feed ingredients playing out much here.
They've increased it a little bit, but it's just in terms of how much volume China does in terms of soybeans, it's very hard for them to switch to any other alternative. So even if they import sunflower meal from Ukraine, that's a relatively small market compared to the soybean markets in the US or Brazil. So there are definitely some changes happening on the margin. Um, but ultimately, there's still a very large hog herd. It needs to be fed. And some of these alternatives can reduce the amount of soybeans China needs, but none of them are really going to be able to replace it, even if there's several different alternatives being used.
So it's a very difficult conversation to have, I guess, because soybean makes such a huge part of the feed formula, and just switching away from it is not going to be easy. Similarly, other Asian countries also, I guess, are going to face the same challenges.
Yeah, I think other countries in the region are, going to have a similar challenge. And you've basically seen within China and especially within other countries, obviously rising incomes, and that also means rising meat consumption, rising protein consumption. And so some of that can obviously come from imports of meat, but I think most countries ultimately want to have their own domestic production. And that means either you import protein, such as soybeans, from other countries, or you import soybean meal or sort of processed meals. So many countries in the region they want to increase their own domestic production. But even if you increase the domestic production, it's probably not going to rise quite as fast as the amount of demand. So I think it's going to be a bit of both, that countries are going to try to use GM crops to increase their own production. But in the long term, demand is going to outpace that. So they're going to need to either import meat, or they're going to need to import protein like soybeans, rapeseed, sunflower seed from other countries.
So in a sense, that is, and these are going to be GM crops, which are mainly coming, if they are going to come from North America and even South America, mostly, they're going to come into Asia in GM form. So I guess might as well grow it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically the argument. Yes, and it's also a thing where I think while consumers are hesitant about GM crops, they tend to be more hesitant when it comes to something that they're consuming directly. So in the case of China, that's usually either things like soybean oil, where you might have soybean oil that's from GM crops versus non-GM crops, and consumers care more about that. But once it's sort of used far upstream in the production process for making animal feed, for example, consumers don't really care if they're eating chicken or pork, or if that chicken or if that hog, if they ate GM crops, because it's sort of separated far enough along the value chain that consumers aren't really too worried about it. Most of the worries that consumers have tend to be things that they're consuming directly. So whether that's cooking oil, whether that's let's say tofu that comes from a GM soybean rather than an organic soybean. So I think when it comes to animal feed, a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, they might as well grow that domestically, because consumers really don't care that much if it's not going into them directly, if it's going in instead to the livestock.
So you're saying that if we separate the GM crops that are grown in Asia as just for animal feed, there would be more acceptance on the ground.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and that's the situation right now with soybeans in China. You basically have two parallel markets. You've got the non-GMO, which is mostly grown within China, and then you have the imported, which is from the US or from Brazil, and that is obviously GM. But in that case, if it's imported GM, it's treated only as animal feed. You can't separate them. You can't try to mix it in, and they basically trade as different markets. So you've got the domestic soybeans, which are non-GM, which trade around $25 a bushel. They're incredibly expensive. But then you have a sort of separate soybean market, which is just imported, and that has to be tracked, and it goes only into animal feed. And so there's basically two separate markets. And I think that's part of the reason that consumers, at least within China, they're okay with that, because it's basically separate markets.
How do you overall see China's GM policy? Do you see it being successful, or there are a lot of challenges to go ahead? I mean, what can other Asian countries take from this?
I think they're going to be successful, but it's going to take some time. It's obviously been sort of a slow adoption, and it's also been a relatively sharp reversal. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that China was rejecting corn cargoes or corn shipments from the U.S. because they had the unapproved GM in them. So I think it's a bit of a sharp reversal in terms of China. They're obviously putting a lot of money and a lot of resources into this now, but I think it's ultimately just a matter of winning over consumers. And part of that is basically education. Part of that is also, I think, appealing to the idea that it's not imported, that it's grown here, that it's grown by people in our country, and that it's safe. And so I think a lot of it comes down to not just the technology side, but also winning over consumers, whether that's through public campaigns or advertisements or education, where it's basically, yes, we have to focus on the technology, but we also need to focus on, explaining to consumers that these products are safe and scientific and tested. And so I think a lot of the countries will also need to focus on that public education aspect.
That's true. And I hope, I mean, China is a country which is way more, they have a one policy kind of mindset, which other countries might find hard to follow. So, do you have maybe any suggestions for in terms of pushing this issue? Because I think going forward, as you said, demand for meat is going to increase. And in that sense, we have to look at how we're going to meet the demand for feed then.
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of it is that a lot of people basically want to know where their food comes from, right? So especially now these days, the supply chains and the complexity are really hard for a lot of people to understand. So if you have, let's say, soybeans, the whole process of them growing, getting harvested, shipped from Brazil, going to a feed mill, getting crushed, getting mixed in with other nutrients or grains, then being fed to the poultry or the hogs or the cows, and then those getting slaughtered and then distributed to market. And I mean, it's a very complex supply chain. And I think ultimately, there is more, I think there's more desire among the public to know where their food comes from. It's not been that long historically since people had their own farms, had their own animals, they knew where it came from. And so I think there's this desire for people to understand the sort of process behind it. And I think that's something that we're seeing a bit more in, at least in developed countries like the US or in Europe, where people want to know what farm it came from. They want to know the conditions of that farm. They want to know basically where their food is coming from. And so I think when it comes to GM, the same thing applies there, where if people, I think, have a better understanding of where it's coming from, then they're also going to be more willing to accept that. So I think that's on both governments, but also companies to try to do, public education and explain the process that goes into this and basically the people behind it and why they also believe it's safe.
Okay, that's a good point to wrap things up with. Thank you so much, Darin, for explaining this very complicated process and chain. And let's hope at least China has a breakthrough here.
Yes, absolutely.
Hope you enjoyed listening to the podcast and keep an ear out for how fast the GM train comes to China. Thank you for listening to us at Asian Agribiz Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast to keep up to date on the latest happenings in the animal protein industry in Asia. This is Rush signing off for Asian Agribiz.